If the sun vanished right now, Earth would still look normal for about 8 more minutes. How can a dead star still light your morning? And what exactly happens when that final light runs out? Tonight, we stay inside those last minutes of normal life and follow Earth right up to the moment the truth arrives. The strangest part of this story is not the darkness, it is the delay. Because most people imagine the sun disappearing as one instant, one clean break. Light gone, heat gone, panic everywhere. But that is not how it would begin. It would begin with a normal morning, a morning so normal that if you did not already know what had happened, you would notice absolutely nothing. That is what makes this idea so hard for the mind to hold. The event itself would already be real, but the evidence would still be traveling. Sunlight does not reach Earth instantly. It needs time. A little more than 8 minutes. So if the sun somehow vanished, not dimmed, not slowly collapsed, not hidden behind dust, but simply stopped existing, the light already on its way to Earth would keep going. And for those final minutes, our planet would stay lit by a star that was already gone. That means the last ordinary morning on Earth would happen after the sun had already disappeared. Think about how unnatural that feels. We trust light more than almost anything. If a room is bright, we assume the source is there. If sunlight is falling through a window, we assume the sun still exists. We do not live as if vision is delayed. We live as if sight is immediate. And on Earth, most of the time, that shortcut works well enough. But on the scale of space, it fails completely. The universe does not show you things as they are. It shows you things as they were when their light began traveling. The moon you see is from a little over a second ago. The sun is from several minutes ago. The stars are from years, centuries, sometimes thousands of years ago. Astronomy is strange partly because it forces you to accept this. Whenever you look up, you are always looking backward. And in this case, that delay would stop being a fact from science class and become the final grace period for an entire planet. So let us stay inside it, not in the aftermath, not in the panic, not in the frozen oceans or the dark continents. Not yet. Stay in the ordinary world for a moment. Somewhere it is early morning. A bedroom is filling with pale light. Someone opens one eye, reaches for a phone, and rolls back under a blanket. Somewhere else, people are already driving. Red lights reflected on windshields, coffee and cup holders, radio voices in the background. A shopkeeper turns a key. A teacher writes the date. A child complains about getting dressed. A dog pulls toward the door. A plane lifts off into a sky that still looks perfectly reliable. Every one of those tiny scenes matters, because they are all happening under false certainty. The sun is gone, but Earth has not been told yet. And the delay would not just fool people, it would fool the whole planet. Solar panels would still be collecting energy. Plants would still be taking in light. Shadows would still form the way they always do. Ocean surfaces would still flash white where the angle is right. A window frame would still cut bright lines across a floor. You could step outside, squint into the morning, and feel completely safe inside a system that had already broken. That is the real emotional center of this story. Not destruction, delayed truth. We usually imagine danger as something loud, something that announces itself, an alarm, a shockwave, a dramatic change in the sky. But this would arrive quietly. The first phase of planetary disaster would not look like disaster at all. It would look like one more ordinary day, and that is far more unsettling, because it means the world can already be lost, while life still feels familiar. And before we go further, it helps to remember that humanity has felt a weaker version of this fear before. Not the sun vanishing. That did not happen. But there was a period in history when people looked up and saw a sky that no longer behaved the way it should. In AD 536, writers described the sun as dim, weak, strangely muted. Daylight felt wrong, not absent, but damaged. The most likely cause was volcanic material high in the atmosphere, a veil in the sky, not the death of the sun itself. But psychologically, the effect matters, because human beings have already lived through a year when sunlight lost its normal authority. The world still functioned, but daylight stopped feeling trustworthy. And once that happens, something deep in the mind starts to shift, because sunlight is not just illumination, it is reassurance. It tells crops when to grow, bodies when to wake, animals when to move, and civilization when the day has properly begun. When the sun starts acting strangely, people do not need astronomy to understand that something is wrong. They feel it immediately. AD 536 matters here for one reason. It proves that even a partial disruption in sunlight can feel profound. Now imagine something much worse. Not the sun dimmed by haze, not a weakened disk behind atmospheric dust, but a normal-looking sky whose source has already ceased to exist. That would be stranger than any ancient omen, because in this case, there would be no warning sign at first. The light would remain clean. The morning would still open on schedule, and that makes these last minutes almost impossible to process. They would not feel like the final minutes of sunlight. They would feel like proof that everything is still fine. Now there is another detail that makes this even colder. If the sun vanished in a truly impossible instant, the change would not reach Earth only in light. It would also take time for gravity to stop affecting us. That matters because many people imagine Earth immediately flying off into deep space. But for those same final minutes, Earth would continue moving as if the sun were still there. The orbit would still hold. The planet would still curve through the same path, because the information that the sun was gone would not have reached us yet. So the lie would be total. The light would say the sun still exists. Gravity would say the sun still exists. Every practical signal the solar system gives Earth would still agree. For a brief time, the old reality would continue performing itself, even though the source had already disappeared. That is one of the most chilling ideas in modern physics. Reality can change, and you can still be trapped for a while inside the previous version of it. Because information has to travel. There is no instant update, no cosmic emergency broadcast, no sky-wide announcement. Distance itself becomes part of the drama. The sun is close by the standards of the universe, but not close enough to erase delay. And in those final 8 minutes, delay becomes the whole story. So let us count down more carefully, not second by second, but layer by layer. At around 8 minutes remaining, nothing seems unusual. If you are outside, the air still carries the memory of the morning. If you are inside, sunlight still falls across walls, car seats, breakfast tables, office glass. The Earth is still receiving old light and old gravity, still obedient to a reality that has already ended. At 7 minutes, people continue making decisions that assume tomorrow exists in a familiar form. Meetings are scheduled. School lessons begin. Orders are placed. Arguments start. Someone laughs at something small and stupid. Someone says, "See you later," and means it. That is part of what gives this scenario its weight. Human life is full of tiny future promises. And in these minutes, the future has already changed more completely than anyone can imagine. At 6 minutes, the visual world is still intact. Blue sky where there should be blue sky. Warm brightness where there should be warm brightness. Cars still gleam. Rivers still reflect. Glass towers still shine. No one looks up because nothing is asking to be looked at. And that is the trap. The sun is usually too stable to think about. It does not feel like an active participant in daily life. It feels permanent, background, guaranteed, like gravity, like air, like the idea that morning will still become noon. But remove it, and you realize how much of civilization depends on a star nobody consciously notices most of the day. At 5 minutes, plants are still doing what they evolved to do, absorbing light that is about to run out forever. Solar systems are still charging. Rooftops are still warming. Birds are still navigating by conditions that are about to end. There is something cruel in that continuation. The living world would keep responding to sunlight with total trust, even though that trust was already outdated. At 4 minutes, our ordinary confidence would be at its highest, because the sky would still be making the same promise it has always made. Light means source. Warmth means stability. Day means tomorrow. That is how the body reads the world. But none of those readings would be true anymore. This is why the first day without the sun is not really about darkness. It is about betrayal. A star we depended on would be gone, and the universe would let us remain calm just long enough to make the realization unbearable. At 3 minutes, Earth is still moving through the old arrangement, still held in the familiar curve of orbit, still lit by the last completed sentence the sun ever sent. And that may be the cleanest way to picture light here, as a sentence, a physical sentence crossing space, photon after photon, wave after wave, message after message. And when the source disappears, the sentence does not shatter. It simply keeps arriving until it runs out, somewhere over open water, or a mountain range, or a suburban street. There is a final stream of ordinary sunlight still on its way. That last light is not symbolic. It is real. A final delivery already in transit. A final piece of day moving toward a planet that does not yet understand what it is losing. At 2 minutes, the whole Earth is living on momentum. Not only physical momentum, but emotional momentum, social momentum, biological momentum. Bodies still wake the same way. Traffic still moves the same way. Institutions still assume continuity. It is not just that the sun would still be visible. It is that almost everything on Earth would still be behaving as if the larger order of reality were untouched. This is what makes the scenario feel so eerie. Not immediate chaos, delayed recognition, the gap between truth and awareness. And that gap is something human beings understand in other parts of life too. A medical result that exists before you hear it. A message sent before it is opened. A loss that becomes real to you only when the information arrives. On a cosmic scale, this would be that same structure. Reality first, understanding later. At 1 minute, nothing in the sky yet carries the full emotional meaning of what has happened. The world still looks inhabited by the same star, and for a few last moments, it still is, in the only way that matters to eyes and skin, through arriving light. But now we are close enough to feel the edge of it. The final sunlight is not infinite. It is finite, countable, bounded. There is an actual last beam somewhere in that stream, a last glow crossing space, a last moment of ordinary brightness approaching Earth at light speed. And because our planet rotates, because people live in different places, because morning and noon and afternoon exist at once across the globe, that ending would not feel the same everywhere. Some places would lose a strong midday sky. Others would lose a softer morning. Some would be in darkness already and wake into a world that can never become day again. Even inside a single global event, there would still be local versions of shock. That is what makes planetary stories so human. The same fact reaches everyone differently. But before the shock, there is still this, the final intact layer of normal life, the final illusion of continuity, the final stretch where every clock still feels useful, every plan still feels ordinary, every beam of sunlight still feels earned. And this is the moment I keep coming back to. Not the freezing oceans, not the ruined harvests, not the long collapse after. This moment, the one where nothing visible has broken yet, because this is where astronomy becomes intimate. It stops being a fact about stars and becomes a fact about kitchens, schools, roads, pets sleeping on windowsills, the warmth on a hand, the brightness on a floor. It becomes a fact about how long a human being can live inside a lie told by distance. AD 536 showed what happens when daylight grows weak and strange. People noticed, feared it, wrote about it. The world felt wrong because the sun no longer looked reliable. In our scenario, the cruelty is sharper because the sun would still look reliable right until the edge. Nothing would be dim yet. Nothing would be warning you. The system would not look damaged. It would look complete. And that is why these final minutes belong in part 1. Because once the last light actually stops arriving, the story changes. Up to this point, the terror is philosophical, physical, anticipatory. It lives in the gap between event and awareness. But the moment that gap closes, everything becomes immediate. The sky changes meaning, Earth changes status, and the human mind loses the last excuse to believe this is still just another morning. We are almost there now, still inside borrowed daylight, still held by borrowed gravity, still standing in the last ordinary version of the world. And in part 2, that delay ends. The 8th minute arrives, and the sky finally tells the truth. The 8th minute arrives, and the sun is gone. Not dim, not hidden, not eclipsed. Gone. There is no explosion in the sky, no giant sound, no warning siren from the universe. One moment the world still has a source, and the next, it does not. This is the first shock. Not cold, not impact, not chaos, just absence. The disk of the sun disappears, and with it, the entire logic of daytime. Every shadow on Earth loses its maker. Every bright surface loses the reason it was bright. The sky does not slowly think about changing. It changes. The blue begins to collapse. The white glare is gone. The brilliance that made people squint, that flooded windows, that turned oceans silver, that heated roads and rooftops, stops arriving. And for the first time in human history, a full daylit Earth understands that daylight was never the sky itself. It was the sun. The planet does not feel this as a dramatic jolt. That part surprises people. Because most minds want a cinematic reaction, a violent shudder, some obvious physical blow. But the sun disappearing would not hit Earth like a hammer. There is no giant punch. No one falls over because the sun is gone. The body does not instantly register astronomy. What it registers first is visual wrongness, a kind of impossible correction. The world still has buildings, roads, clouds, mountains, faces, but the light holding them together has been removed. And that may be even worse than instant darkness, because it is not ordinary darkness. Night is familiar. Night arrives with warning. Colors soften. The horizon changes. The body prepares. This would not be like that. This would be noon losing its foundation. It would be morning being canceled in real time. It would be afternoon, interrupted by a universe that no longer cares what hour it is. Across the day side of Earth, people would look up almost at once, some out of instinct, some because the brightness changed so suddenly that the eyes would hunt for a cause, some because everything around them would look flatter, colder, harder to trust. A street that was vivid a second ago would feel drained. A classroom near a window, an airport runway, a field, a beach, an office tower. All of it would enter a light that does not belong to any human category. Not day, not sunset, not weather. Something else. Something without precedent. And even then, the human mind would resist the truth, because people do not jump to the most impossible answer. They would think eclipse, storm front, atmospheric event, power of some kind, mass hallucination, anything but the actual fact. That resistance would last only seconds for some, longer for others. But it would be there, because the real explanation is too large for the first moment of seeing. And at that exact same time, another change arrives. Not in light, but in gravity. The sun's pull on Earth would end when the final information about its disappearance reached us. That means the same delay that let us keep seeing the sun also let Earth keep orbiting it. And now that grace period is over. This is where the geometry of the solar system changes forever. Not with a snap you can feel in your knees, but with a silent rewrite of the path we are on. Up to this instant, Earth has been curving around the sun, falling around it, held in a long, continuous arc. Now the curve ends. Earth keeps moving, because motion does not need permission to continue. But it no longer bends around the center that used to hold it. It starts traveling forward in a straight line, tangent to the orbit it used to have. That is one of the strangest truths in all of this. At the very moment people are staring at a ruined sky, the planet itself has already changed course. Not dramatically to the senses, not in a way that throws oceans from their basins, but absolutely, irreversibly. Every calendar on Earth would still say the same date. Every clock would still tick. Every city would still stand where it stood seconds earlier. And yet, our world would no longer belong to a solar system in the way it did before. It would already be leaving, already committed to a path that never again closes into a year. Seasons end here, not because winter arrives instantly, but because the mechanism behind seasons is gone. There will be no next spring in the old sense, no next summer driven by return, no next sunrise caused by a living star waiting over the horizon. There will still be rotation. Earth will keep turning, but it will now turn under a sky that can never deliver morning again. That realization would not land all at once. It would come in waves. The first wave is visual, the second is intellectual, the third is emotional. The first wave says, something impossible just happened to the sky. The second says, the sun is not behind anything, it is absent. And the third is where people begin to understand what absence means. Not just dark, not just colder, but untethered. Imagine what those first seconds would look like in different places. Over oceans. Daylight dies over moving water. A fisherman sees the surface lose its glitter, then lose its logic. Pilots above the cloud line watch brightness drop in a way that no training covers. In cities, glass towers that were blazing a second ago go dull. Traffic keeps moving because traffic always keeps moving for a few seconds after reality changes. Pedestrians slow down. Phone cameras come up. Someone laughs because the first response to impossible things is often the wrong emotion. Someone else freezes completely. On highways, drivers instinctively touch brakes because the whole visual world just shifted. In schools, children look to adults, and adults look to windows, which is its own kind of terror, because the people who are supposed to explain the world are now staring at it the same way everyone else is. Animals would react too. Birds are especially important here, because birds trust light directly. A sudden global loss of sunlight would hit them before it became language for us. Some would drop from active daytime behavior into confused roosting patterns. Others would scatter. Dogs would respond to human alarm. Livestock would bunch and strain against familiar routines. The biological clock of the planet would take the blow before it could understand the source. And then there is the sky itself. What does a dayside sky look like with no sun? This part matters because people often imagine a clean switch to full black, like turning off a studio lamp. The real transition would be fast, but not cartoonishly simple. The blue of the sky exists because sunlight scatters through the atmosphere. Remove the sunlight, and that blue loses support immediately. The broad glow that filled the whole dome of the sky would fade hard. Very bright planets and stars could begin to appear while watches still say morning. Clouds would still be there, but no longer painted from within by the sun. They would become shapes without their old drama. The horizon would still exist. Mountains would still exist. Cities would still exist. But the emotional command of the scene would be broken. This is not what human beings are built to see. A star field where noon should be. That image alone would become one of the defining traumas in the history of consciousness. Because it would tell people in one glance that Earth is not under weather anymore. Earth is under astronomy. And that change in scale is devastating. Up to now, the world has always seemed local enough to live in, even when it is large. You worry about your city, your family, your country, your work, your body. But when the sun vanishes, the frame explodes outward. The cause is not political, not economic, not military, not geological, not even earthly. It comes from the center of the system itself. And that instantly makes every human concern feel both precious and terribly small. For many people, that might be the exact second panic finally begins. Not at the loss of brightness, but at the understanding of scale. Because once you know what has happened, you also know there is nowhere to appeal. No infrastructure can restart a star. No border matters. No government prepares for this. No stored belief about how reality works is large enough to soften it. Still, the body would go on doing body things. Adrenaline, shallow breathing, rapid questions, reaching for others, grabbing phones, calling names, trying to turn the impossible into procedure. That is one of the defining human patterns. When reality breaks, we search for tasks, turn on lights, check signal, find loved ones, open news, wait for authority, refresh the screen, look again, and again, and again, expecting the universe to reverse itself because the mind cannot accept finality at planetary scale in one pass. Some systems would react instantly. Solar power generation on the day side would plunge, not because the panels failed, but because the source did. That means grids with heavy solar dependence would suddenly lose supply, not everywhere equally, not all at once in the same way, but sharply enough to matter. Backup systems would come online in some places. Batteries would absorb a little shock. Operators would be staring at data that makes no sense. Meanwhile, satellites powered by solar arrays would not all die immediately. Many have batteries. Many can ride through the first phase, which creates another eerie layer of delay. Technology, like the atmosphere, would keep pretending continuity for a while. This story keeps doing that. Old momentum, borrowed stability, systems living on what was already in motion, and the air itself would play the same trick. People think the cold is immediate, that the moment the sun is gone, the world flash freezes. But air and ocean have thermal inertia. Earth is not a thin sheet of metal left out in space. It stores heat. The surface would begin losing more energy than it gains, because now it gains none from the sun. but the warmth already present would not vanish in a breath. That means something psychologically brutal. For a little while after the sky proves the truth, the air may still feel almost normal. There would still be warmth in walls, in pavement, in water, in your skin. And that mismatch would make the event even harder to process. Because cold is the consequence people expect, and yet at first, the body might still be standing in yesterday's warmth, looking up at a sky that has already ended. That is a nightmare kind of lag. Visual catastrophe, thermal delay. The mind wants all parts of reality to agree, but they would not. The eyes say the world is broken. The skin says it is not broken yet. And the gap between those two messages would be unbearable. This is where AD 536 becomes useful again, because that event taught people what it feels like when daylight is no longer trustworthy. But this is beyond mistrust. In 536, the sun looked wrong. Now it is absent. In 536, civilization felt deep unease. Here, civilization would understand in one impossible blow that every plan built on dawn has just been canceled. No crop schedule survives this. No long-term grid model survives this. No shipping calendar, no school year, no tourist season, no energy forecast. Everything built on tomorrow's light has just become historical. And yet, in the first minutes, life would still look stubbornly physical. Cars would still coast. Subways would still move. Planes would still fly. Waves would still break. People would still be holding shopping bags, answering messages, standing in line. The old world does not disappear just because its future has. It lingers. That is what makes it tragic. You would be looking at continuity and extinction in the same frame. A child still eating breakfast, under a sky where stars are beginning to show. A commuter train still entering a station, on a planet that has already left its orbit forever. A hand still warm from a coffee cup, while the primary energy source of the biosphere is gone. That contrast is stronger than screaming. It does not need noise. It is already unbearable. And then comes the question that would spread almost as fast as fear. What happens next? Not in theory, not in astrophysics. What happens next to us? To temperature, to food, to power, to oceans, to animals, to the night side, to the next day that is no longer coming. This is the point where the event stops being visual and becomes practical. People would begin trying to translate cosmic fact into human time. How long until freezing? How long until crops fail? How long until the grid becomes unstable? How long until governments speak? How long until it is unsurvivable? That conversion, from awe to timetable, is the moment humanity fully enters survival mode. And the timetable matters, because despite the horror of the sky, the surface would not become instantly unlivable. Not in seconds, not in minutes. That matters, because it means Earth gets one more terrible gift. Time to understand, time to fear, time to organize, time to fail or adapt. The darkness is immediate enough to be unforgettable. The cold is slow enough to become a second story. And that second story is where the next part begins. Because once the sun is gone from the sky, the question is no longer whether Earth knows. Now Earth knows. The question becomes how long a warm planet can stay warm. How long oceans and air can lend us the heat of a dead star. And what the first hours without sunlight really look like. The orbit is gone. The daylight is over. The shock has landed. But the planet is still holding yesterday's energy in its air, its ground, its water. For a little while longer, Earth is alive on stored sunlight. And in part 3, that stored sunlight starts to run out. The sky has already told the truth. Now the planet begins to feel it. This is the part people often imagine incorrectly. They imagine the moment after the sun disappears as instant death, instant ice, instant silence. But Earth does not die that quickly, and that almost makes it worse. Because for the first hours, the world would still be alive enough to move, warm enough to function, familiar enough to confuse you. That is the cruelty of thermal inertia. The air still holds heat. The ground still holds heat. The oceans hold enormous amounts of heat. Buildings hold heat. Roads hold heat. Your skin holds heat. The sun is gone, but the warmth it left behind is still everywhere. For a little while, Earth would be living on stored sunlight. Not new sunlight, old sunlight. Yesterday's warmth, this morning's warmth. Summer warmth trapped in oceans. Afternoon warmth trapped in concrete. Heat gathered slowly, now being spent all at once by a world that cannot earn anymore. That is the real beginning of the first hours without the sun. Not freezing, spending. Earth would become a planet burning through savings. And like every system living on savings, it would look more stable than it really is. Step outside in those first hours, and depending on where you were, the air might still feel strangely normal. Not comfortable in the emotional sense. Nothing about the emotional reality would be normal anymore. But physically, the temperature might not yet match the horror in the sky. That mismatch would be devastating, because bodies trust immediate sensation. If your hands are not freezing, if your breath is not yet visible, if the pavement still gives back warmth, some part of the mind keeps whispering that maybe this is survivable. Maybe the world has not fully changed. Maybe there is still a hidden explanation. But the explanation is already above you. Stars where daylight should be. The body may hesitate. Physics does not. The heat budget of Earth has been broken. For billions of years, our planet has been running on a simple exchange. Energy comes in from the sun. Energy leaves back into space. The atmosphere, the oceans, the seasons, the winds, the water cycle, all of it exists inside that flow. Now the input is gone. Nothing replaces it. Earth is still radiating heat outward, but no sunlight is coming in to balance the loss. That means every minute now has a direction, colder. Every hour has a direction, colder. The question is not whether the planet will cool. The question is how fast each part cools, and which systems fail first. This is where the event stops feeling like astronomy and becomes infrastructure, biology, food, shelter, water, time. Because the first hours after the sun's disappearance would split the world into two kinds of reality: the visible reality and the systems reality. The visible reality is what people would notice first: the darkened sky, the stars, the strange false night on the day side. The systems reality is slower, quieter, but in many ways more dangerous. Power grids would enter stress almost immediately. Not everywhere the same way, and not because all electricity would vanish in one cinematic blackout, but because a major source of energy on the day side would already be gone. Solar production drops to zero. Operators would be staring at numbers that do not belong to any trained scenario. Demand patterns would begin changing wildly. People turn on lights, screens, heaters in some places, cooling systems in others. Communication systems surge. Transport systems keep moving for now. And every one of those systems assumes there will still be energy tomorrow. That assumption is now broken. The first hours would be a race between stored order and rising fear. Backup power would help. Batteries would help. Fuel reserves would help. But all of those are temporary tools built for short disruptions. Storms, regional outages, damage to lines, not the disappearance of the star that powers the biosphere. That is the key difference. Human systems are designed to absorb shocks inside a living planet. This would be the start of a dead energy planet, still warm, still active, but no longer renewing itself. And then there is weather. People think weather would stop immediately. It would not. The atmosphere has momentum too. Winds would still blow, clouds would still move, waves would still break against coasts. Storms already forming would still have structure for a while, because weather is not just light, it is stored heat moving around. The air would keep doing what moving air does, at least at first, but the larger machine behind weather would already be shutting down. No sunrise reheating the land, no daytime energy pulse, no fresh solar contrast driving the ordinary rhythm between surface and atmosphere. The world would still have air, but it would no longer have weather in the old sense for long. It would have leftovers. The first hours are full of leftovers. Leftover heat, leftover motion, leftover confidence, leftover routine. That word matters, because it explains why this stage feels so eerie. Everything is still happening, but almost everything is happening on borrowed time. Take the oceans. They are the great thermal bank of Earth. More than the air, more than the land. The oceans are why the planet does not instantly become a frozen rock. They store vast amounts of energy and release it slowly. That sounds comforting, until you realize what it means. It means humanity would be able to survive the first hours precisely because the planet had once been loved by the sun. The ocean would still be giving us the memory of a star that no longer exists. That memory would delay total collapse, but not prevent it. Coastal regions might remain physically milder for longer than inland regions. Cities with oceans nearby might not feel the first temperature drop as brutally as dry interiors. Water changes slowly. Land changes faster. Concrete cools. Soil cools. Rooftops cool. Cars cool. Fields cool. But seawater keeps holding the past a little longer. And that means the map of human fear would not be equal. Some places would look and feel apocalyptic almost immediately. Others would look apocalyptic in the sky, but eerily survivable at ground level for a little longer. That is a dangerous combination, because unequal fear produces unequal decisions. Some people would panic and run too soon. Some would delay too long. Some governments would try to manage the event like a temporary emergency. Others would understand faster that this is no emergency. This is a permanent change in planetary status. And as that realization spreads, the next question becomes biological. What happens to life in the first hours without sunlight? The answer is not simple death. Life does not work like a switch, but the foundation under life has shifted instantly. Photosynthesis stops where there is no usable light. That means plants are no longer making new energy from the sky. For a few hours, that does not look dramatic. A forest does not visibly collapse in one afternoon. A field does not turn to dust before evening. Grass still looks like grass. Leaves still hold color. Crops still stand in rows. But the process has stopped. The endless daily conversion of light into stored life has ended. And that matters because the biosphere is not just living things. It is a timing system, a rhythm system, a feeding system, a waking system. Daylight tells flowers when to open, birds when to sing, insects when to move, mammals when to rest or hunt. Take away the light, and you do not just remove beauty. You scramble timing at planetary scale. The first hours would be full of biological confusion. Birds forced into the wrong behavior. Insects changing pattern too early. Pet animals reacting not to the sky alone, but to the stress of the humans around them. livestock bunching, wildlife hesitating. The living world would not yet understand extinction, but it would already understand interruption. And interruption is enough to create panic. Then there is food. This is where human beings move from awe into arithmetic. How much do we have? How long does it last? How far can it move? The disappearance of the sun does not empty supermarket shelves in 10 minutes, but it changes the meaning of every shelf on Earth. Food is no longer part of a cycle. It is part of an inventory. That is one of the most important psychological breaks in the entire scenario. A crop before the event is future food. A crop after the event is limited food. A greenhouse before the event is production. A greenhouse after the event is delayed loss. Every orchard, every field, every fishing schedule, every refrigerated chain, every grain reserve suddenly belongs to a countdown world, and people would feel that quickly, not because all shortages begin at once, but because everyone knows what the sun means. You do not need advanced science to understand that plants without sunlight are not a long-term plan. You do not need a government briefing to understand that a dark Earth is a food clock, that awareness would spread through conversation faster than formal explanation. What do we eat? How long will power last? Can we grow anything under artificial light? Who gets fuel? Who gets heat? Who gets transport? Once those questions begin, society enters a new phase. The event stops being something happening to the sky and becomes something happening to human trust. The first hours would be full of messaging, leaders speaking, experts speaking, rumors multiplying, screens refreshing. Every institution on Earth would be trying to do the same thing at once, translate cosmic finality into instructions, and that is almost impossible, because no sentence is large enough. Shelter in place sounds too small. Evacuate sounds ridiculous. Remain calm sounds insulting. The truth is too big for emergency language. That alone would fracture public response. Some people would become extremely practical. Fill water, charge everything, gather family, seek underground space. Others would collapse into disbelief, because disbelief is what the mind does when reality exceeds emotional scale. And then there would be the night side, the part of Earth already in darkness when the sun vanished. For them, the first hours are psychologically different. They would not witness daylight disappear. They would receive the event through other people first, through messages, alarms, strange reports, a rising sense that dawn is no longer on its way. That may be its own special terror. To stand in an ordinary night, knowing the sun is gone, and knowing that morning is no longer an upcoming event, only a word from the old world. Imagine a child going to sleep while adults are whispering that sunrise will never happen again. Imagine cities in darkness already, watching video from the dayside where stars appeared at noon. The globe would be united by one fact, but split by how that fact arrives. Some watch the sky change, some wait for a dawn that never comes, and both are horrifying in different ways. There is another layer here too, communication delay inside society. Just as Earth lived through a delay in receiving the truth from the sun, human civilization would live through a second delay, the delay of information spreading across billions of people, some connected, some isolated, some trusting, some denying. There would be communities that understood immediately, communities that doubted for hours, communities that kept following old routine because human beings are wired to repeat the familiar until reality physically blocks them. That means the first hours would not be one single emotional event. They would be millions of local endings unfolding under one planetary condition. A hospital switching into crisis planning, a family filling a bathtub, a farmer staring at fields that still look healthy, a pilot receiving instructions nobody has ever written before. A city mayor saying words they do not believe themselves. A child asking a question that no parent can answer honestly. And all the while, temperature continues its slow turn. Not dramatic enough to finish the story, but real enough to begin it. The loss of sunlight would start being measured not only in the sky, but in surfaces. Metal railings cooling faster than walls. Open ground cooling faster than water. Dry air responding differently than humid air. Clear regions shedding heat differently than cloudy ones. People would begin noticing it not as one global plunge, but as 1,000 local sensations. The room feels different. The car heater matters more. The pavement is losing its stored warmth. The air by the window feels sharper now. This is how the planet begins changing the body, quietly, through surfaces first. And maybe that is the best way to understand these hours. They are not the hours when Earth dies. They are the hours when Earth stops pretending it can go on as before. The old heat is still here, but only because the old sun was here. The old systems are still here, but only because they were built yesterday. The old routines are still here, but only because people cannot let go of them instantly. This whole part of the story is about momentum. Physical momentum, social momentum, psychological momentum. The world keeps moving after the cause is gone, not because the cause did not matter, but because large systems take time to show their wound. That is why Part 3 matters so much, because this is the last stretch where humanity can still mistake delay for survival. The skies have gone impossible, but the ground is still giving back heat. The crops are doomed, but the fields still look alive. The star is gone, but the planet still feels inhabited by its past. For a few terrible hours, Earth would remain a warm memory of itself, and that memory would let us breathe, plan, argue, pray, organize, and make the first decisions of the longest night in our history. But memory runs out. Stored sunlight runs out. The heat in the air begins thinning. The heat in the ground begins draining. The heat in the oceans begins the long, impossible task of keeping a dark world alive. And when those reserves stop feeling like background comfort and start becoming the only thing standing between civilization and frozen collapse, the story changes again. Then it is no longer about the first hours. It becomes about the first days, the first week, the first real winter of a sunless Earth. And that is where Part 4 begins. The first shock is over. The first hours are over. Now begins the version of the story that does not arrive in one moment. It arrives in layers. The long, dark Earth. This is the part where the planet stops feeling interrupted and starts feeling changed. Permanently changed. By now, humanity would understand the basic truth. The sun is not coming back tomorrow. This is not an eclipse, not volcanic haze, not a long storm, not a season that will pass. The system itself is gone. And once that truth settles in, the question changes again. It is no longer, what happened? It becomes, how long can anything still live here? The first day after the sun disappears would be one of the strangest days in the history of life, because Earth would still look recognizable. Cities would still exist. Roads would still exist. Coastlines, mountains, forests, clouds, all of it still there. But the meaning of all those things would have shifted. A city is no longer a place of growth. It is a machine for spending stored energy. A field is no longer future food. It is the remains of a biological plan that no longer works. An ocean is no longer part of a global climate system. It is a giant reservoir of borrowed warmth. Everything familiar would still be visible, but almost nothing familiar would still be renewable. And that is the key to the long, dark Earth. Not instant destruction, exhaustion, stored fuel, stored food, stored heat, stored order. Everything now runs down. The first day would still be survivable in many regions. That matters, because it gives humanity time to do what humanity always does: organize, argue, prioritize, waste time, save time, cooperate, fight, build lists, make mistakes. Some places would move fast, power grids redirected, fuel reserves protected, critical facilities locked down, hospitals prioritized, data centers stabilized, governments broadcasting survival instructions that grow more honest by the hour. Other places would fragment almost immediately. Panic buying, traffic collapse, conflicting orders, local violence. Systems failing not because the planet is instantly unlivable, but because trust disappears faster than temperature. That is one of the cruelest truths in disasters. Human beings often lose social stability before they lose physical possibility. And in a sunless Earth scenario, that gap would matter enormously. Because for a little while, the question is not only whether the planet can support life. The question is whether civilization can stay organized long enough to use what remains. By the second day, the cooling becomes harder to ignore. Not everywhere equally, not in some neat global pattern, but enough that daily life starts bending around it. Buildings that felt stable now leak heat. Water systems need more protection. Transport becomes harder to justify. Fuel becomes more precious than convenience. The air changes room by room, street by street, city by city. People stop asking whether the sky is real and start asking which places on Earth still make sense to stay in. That question would redraw civilization very quickly. Cold regions become dangerous first. Inland areas become harder faster than coastal ones. Places with weak infrastructure collapse faster than places with stored energy and controlled facilities. And suddenly, human geography changes. Not around wealth alone, not around politics alone, but around heat, power, shelter, and depth. Depth matters now, because the deeper you go, the more you leave behind the emotional world of sunlight and enter the physical world of survival. Underground spaces would become psychologically important almost immediately. Subways, tunnels, mines, deep basements, underground storage, not because they are magical, but because the Earth itself becomes insulation. The ground cools more slowly than the air above it. Below the surface, temperature becomes more stable, less exposed, less violent. That means one of the oldest human instincts would return in a new form. Go inward, go under. Find mass above you, find walls around you, find heat you can keep. There is something almost prehistoric about that. The future of high technology, depending on the same planet, the same stone, the same shelter logic that protected ancient people from a hostile world. But underground does not mean safe forever. It only means slower loss. Every survival plan now depends on one of a few remaining energy sources: stored fuel, nuclear power, geothermal heat, or in very limited cases, hydroelectric systems that can still function for a time inside a collapsing wider network. And that is where the map of possible survival becomes brutally narrow. Because surface civilization as we know it is built on abundance. A daily flood of free solar energy falling across the whole planet. Take that away, and human life contracts toward rare pockets where energy can still be concentrated. This is why the long-term survivors in this scenario would not be random. They would cluster around systems, nuclear facilities, geothermal regions, deep shelters, industrial sites with real thermal planning, perhaps isolated research stations built to endure darkness and confinement better than ordinary cities ever could. Some communities might manage months, some perhaps years, but only if they can solve the same equation again and again. Heat, power, water, food, air, maintenance, order. That is the whole game now. Not flourishing, maintenance. Not growth, continuity. And continuity is much harder than people think, because even when energy exists, society must still decide who gets it. A nuclear plant can generate power, but not infinite trust. A geothermal site can provide heat, but not infinite food. A deep shelter can protect bodies, but not automatically prevent conflict. The longer the sun stays gone, the more survival becomes social engineering as much as engineering. Who stays? Who leaves? Who is allowed in? Who gets medicine? Who gets warmth? Who gets light? Who gets the last reserves? These are not science fiction details. They are the human core of the long, dark Earth. Because when the energy of a star disappears, moral questions do not disappear with it. They sharpen. Meanwhile, the surface keeps changing. The first week would be the moment most of humanity fully understands that Earth is no longer a living climate system in the old sense. Without sunlight, average temperatures keep falling. The exact pace depends on clouds, oceans, latitude, winds, terrain, but the direction never changes. Colder. The land cools faster than the sea. The interiors of continents become harsh faster than coastal zones. Rivers begin changing. Water infrastructure faces freezing stress in more and more regions. Agriculture becomes a dead category walking. Not yet visually erased everywhere, but functionally over. Forests stand as dark inventory. Grasslands as delayed memory. Even green things become historical objects, reminders of a world that used to recharge itself every morning. And this is where the emotional scale of the event deepens, because the first hours are about shock, the first days are about adjustment, but the first week is about grief, real grief, not the dramatic kind from movies, the slow kind, the kind that arrives when people realize the old language no longer fits. There is no forecast, no spring schedule, no recovery date. At some point, someone somewhere would still say, when things go back to normal. And someone else would know, with full clarity, that the phrase normal has already become a memory. That is when the event truly becomes historical. Not when the sun vanishes, not when the sky goes dark, when the mind finally stops waiting for reversal. Some parts of Earth would hold on longer than others. The oceans would be the biggest reason for that. They store so much heat that they would keep softening the collapse for a time. Coastal air would stay more moderate than inland air. Sea ice would not take over the planet in a day. The world would not become a hard, frozen marble all at once. That slow pace matters, because it creates the illusion that maybe adaptation is possible at larger scale than it really is. And to be fair, some adaptation would be possible, for a while. Humans could grow some food under artificial light, in protected environments, if enough energy exists. They could move populations toward more stable zones. They could create underground habitats. They could recycle heat, ration power, use geothermal wells, protect critical medicine production, preserve digital knowledge. Even now, you can imagine enclaves of order surviving inside a deadening world. Small circles of warmth and electricity. Tiny manufactured days inside endless night. And that may be the most haunting image in the whole scenario. Not total extinction in one blow, but islands of artificial morning, deep underground, while the real Earth freezes above them. Rooms with lamps imitating a sun that no longer exists, crops growing under human-made light. Children learning what sunrise used to mean from screens and stories. That would be survival. But it would no longer be civilization in the form we know. It would be inheritance under siege, a species living inside its own backup systems, trying to remember that the surface was once ordinary. There is one more place life might hold on with surprising stubbornness: the deep ocean. Because not all life on Earth depends directly on sunlight. Some ecosystems near hydrothermal vents draw energy from chemistry, not daylight. Those communities would not care about the dark sky in the way forests and fields would, at least not at first. That fact is strangely comforting and strangely lonely. Even if the surface biosphere collapses, some life may continue in darkness below, blind, heat-fed, untouched by sunrise even before the sun was gone. That means Earth would not become fully dead immediately. It would become divided, a ruined surface, a retreating humanity in pockets of engineered warmth, and deep hidden life continuing where sunlight never ruled to begin with. That is a sobering thought, because it reminds us that the sun is not equally central to every form of life, but it is central to ours, to our food, our weather, our cities, our calendars, our bodies, our stories. Our civilization is not just built on the sun in a technical sense. It is built on the expectation of tomorrow's light. Remove that expectation, and you remove more than energy. You remove emotional architecture. Hope changes shape in a sunless world. On today's Earth, hope is often lazy, automatic. Tomorrow comes because it always has. Morning returns because it always does. But in the long, dark Earth, hope would become labor, managed, protected, argued over, powered by reactors, fed by reserves, measured in remaining fuel and stable temperatures. It would no longer rise over the horizon for free. Human beings might survive for years in some form, perhaps longer in carefully controlled systems, but always under one new rule. Every surviving day must now be manufactured. That is the deepest difference. The old Earth gave life its background for free. The new Earth charges for every extra hour. And eventually, that bill grows heavier. Fuel runs down. Machines fail. Maintenance becomes harder. Specialized parts become irreplaceable. Food chains narrow. Psychological strain deepens. Even the enclaves that survive best would begin to feel the pressure of permanence. Because emergency is one thing, forever is another. You can endure extraordinary conditions if you believe they end. It is much harder to endure them when you understand they are now the permanent shape of reality. That realization would arrive slowly, and then all at once, the same way so many truths arrive. At some point, a person in one of those shelters would look at a lamp, a grow light, a heating panel, and understand that this machine is now standing in for a star that is both magnificent and tragic. Magnificent because it shows what intelligence can do under impossible pressure. Tragic because it reveals the scale of what was lost. No reactor is a sun. No underground city is a planet. No engineered ecosystem is a world. They are lifeboats. Ingenious lifeboats, but still lifeboats. And lifeboats exist because the ship is gone. So how does this story really end? Not with one universal final day. Probably not. It ends differently in different places. Some regions fail early from cold, hunger, conflict, or energy collapse. Some endure longer. Some human groups adapt better than expected. Some lose order faster than anyone predicted. Some children are born under artificial light and grow up never seeing a sunrise. Some final witnesses on the surface watch coastlines freeze harder each season. Watch cities darken one district at a time. Watch familiar landscapes become uninhabitable not through fire, but through absence. And beneath it all, deep oceans continue their hidden chemistry, a quiet reminder that Earth is still a planet, even if it is no longer our planet in the old sense. That is why the disappearance of the sun is not just a science question. It is a perspective question. It shows you what part of Earth is borrowed, how much of daily life is really celestial engineering, and how much trust is packed into something we almost never look at for more than a few seconds. The sun feels constant because it has been. So constant that most people live as if its return is a law deeper than all other laws. But it is still a physical thing, a star, and every warm road, every green field, every weather system, every ordinary morning coffee has always depended on that star continuing to exist. The strange thing is, we know this, but we do not feel it. Not fully. Not until a thought experiment like this forces the feeling into focus. And maybe that is the real reason these stories matter. Not because the sun is likely to vanish tomorrow. It is not. But because imagining the loss reveals the gift. The gift was never just heat. It was continuity, renewal, the free return of light, the invisible agreement between Earth and its star. An agreement so stable that entire civilizations forgot it was an agreement at all. If the sun disappeared, the planet would not die in one cinematic instant. It would end in stages. First the delay, then the sky, then the long spending of stored warmth, then the narrowing of life into pockets, then memory doing what sunlight used to do, keeping us going a little longer. That is the final image I would leave you with. Not the moment the sun vanishes, not the first star at noon, not even the freezing cities. This, a small human-made room, warm, lit, alive, somewhere under rock or steel, while above it, the earth turns through endless darkness, still beautiful from a distance, still a planet, but no longer a morning world. And that may be the saddest way to describe it. Not a dead world, a world that lost morning. Because morning is more than brightness. It is the feeling that life gets another beginning. Take that away, and survival continues. But innocence does not. The sun would disappear in one moment, but Earth would end more slowly than that. In delays, in cooling, in decisions, in grief, in adaptation, in memory. And somewhere in that long dark, the last surviving humans would understand something people in the old world almost never had to say out loud. We were never living on Earth alone. We were living inside a relationship between a planet and a star. And when the star was gone, everything we called normal went with it.